leverage ourselves together. And I think, again, thinking about first the difference, if the derivatives are derivative, that is to say they're derived from something else, right? And therefore they seem to be authentic, and they seem, certainly one way of talking about derivatives is that there's something called the real economy, and there's something called finance. And the real economy is where we all need to live, and probably what happened to cause this great debacle was that we got too far away from the real. This is a narrative, actually, that one can hear across the ideological spectrum. And that finance has to do with things that are ethereal, epiphenomenal, representational, symbolic. But the more we go on with that list, the closer it seems that we could be talking about art itself. And indeed, when art gets devalued, it's often along the same lines, right? That there's something real and genuine and authentic that people should be doing. And I think that's a real schizophrenia in the arts. Many polls of people in the United States and elsewhere seem to suggest that people love art and hate artists, or they love the art they love and they hate all other art. When art becomes controversial, it usually becomes merely something that's impossible to talk about in artistic terms. So there's something about the sense that when art starts to circulate like a financial derivative, rather than saying, this is the thing that has value that's moving in the world, it sows a similar kind of technical confusion. And indeed, that's another thing that one could say certainly about contemporary art that's associated with histories of the avant-garde, that it's incredibly technical, it's obscure, it's arcane, it's just for insiders. Right? And again, one thing one could say about the financial crisis is that some geeky quants made some funky formula and made the world blow up. Right? So some of those issues around the claims about the transparency of knowledge, about the ways in which we come to value what's real and what is not, about the difference between, again, something that's real, that it has to do with really producing something, versus something that is ethereal and something that is simply moving around in circulation. So what I want to suggest is that, in a curious way, even though art and derivatives would seem to be as far away as two things could be, many of our ways of talking about them sort of frame them in similar terms. And if we think about that in a human and progressive and critical light, it opens up a whole other set of questions about what our debt capacity might be and the ways in which we might, in fact, have plenty of money, plenty of resources, plenty of capacity to do whatever we want to do. And certainly when you start to look at some of the social ills and put a price tag on them, for example, 2 billion people don't have access to clean drinking water. And the price tag on gaining that access is about $200 billion, which is about 2 months' time occupation in Iraq and Afghanistan. Right? So there's other ways of thinking about our financial capacities as future revenues and income streams, right, that can actually move us from thinking about the obligation of always having more to saying, well, what if we already had plenty? What if, as seems to be the case, there's this incredible abundance of wealth? And it's interesting, despite the fact that in the last year, that the median or midpoint income of households in the United States has gone down by about $4,000. The 400 wealthiest individuals in the United States have seen their income go up by about $200 million. Now, there isn't enough money in those 400 individuals, that's about $1.5 trillion, to take care of the deficit and the debt. But if you were even to look at the top fifth of income and say, if people paid just 0.5% more in their income tax, all of the debt would go away. So there's something very coercive, right, in the ways in which scarcity is being imagined. It becomes more and more difficult to anticipate what all of the different moves are. If there's just one set of exchanges, right? If you and I enter into some sort of contract and it looks like the currency could only move in one direction, up or down, then things are pretty simple. But if, by me betting that the currency is going to go up, it actually does go up, or conversely, and this would be the example of the subprime crisis. If people who did look at the mortgages, and the mortgages were securitized, that means they were bundled together, and then they were collateralized. That means that there was a certain amount of each of those mortgages that was put together. And one of the things that was put together in something called a mortgage-backed security was the likelihood that people would default on their mortgage. And this was something that turned out not to be so difficult to calculate, because if you had people who were getting into mortgages that had a very low initial interest rate, that's called an adjustable rate mortgage, and they didn't have they had ninja, no income, no assets, and no job, then someone could say, and they did, this person or this group of people with these attributes will be able to pay this mortgage for about 2 years, and after that they won't. So what I can do is I can combine this likelihood of people not being able to pay their mortgage with other groups of mortgages with a very different default rate. People who are very unlikely to default based on my estimation of their income. And what I can then do is actually, and this is what Goldman Sachs did, actually bet, or one could say hedge, or put out insurance policies to say, you know what, when we look at this information, it really becomes apparent that these mortgages are going to fail. And this is sort of one of the remarkable things then, that the same thing that would have created stability in managing that risk creates positions that are not only at odds with each other, but become impossible to measure one to the other. Right? That is to say, if everybody is always anticipating what everyone else is going to do, then rather than having what's called transparency, right, the ability to say, yes, these are the trends, and I'm going to be able to see whether or not those trends are legible to me or not, the trends become less and less legible. But of course, that condition, which is called uncertainty, right? Uncertainty is that which you cannot anticipate. Risk is a measure of a departure or a difference from what you might expect. So this is interesting, because this certainly would apply both in finance and in art, right? You start an art project, you don't know quite what's going to happen. You start working, right? And it's only, and the moment of taking the risk is the suspension of some sort of capacity to say, yes, this is what's going to be, right? So there can be some sort of moment of encounter, of discovery, of invention, of creation, right? That would be a standard way of thinking of what risk is doing. But in that sense, both models of risk have to do with some departure from what might be expected. But that departure is in a sense measurable. Right? In the case of finance, it's measurable by the amount of money you make. In art, it's measurable by the fact that you made the artwork. Right? And maybe you went to art school. Maybe you've done this before. Maybe there have been other artists that would say, taking a risk in the arts is not the same as embracing uncertainty. Right? You've got to, you have chops, you have training, you have tools, you have means, right, to make that thing happen. In the same way that someone who manages risk does. So the issue becomes that at a certain point, the kind of density or collection of all of these people who are acting upon possibilities of risk create a situation that, rather than being transparent or legible or readable, becomes actually opaque.